Okay, time now for After the Beat. No time to waste because Jeff has a train to make in a matter of moments, so let us not waste any more time. Let's get to our first question of the day. And let me just say, before we get into it, we have never received this many questions, honestly. Last I checked, we were at like 250. Usually we get around like 80 to 100. So thank you to everyone out there, and I'm sorry that we couldn't get
good questions.
Yeah, maybe that was the difference this time. So this one actually wasn't like a formal question, but it's from our friend Devin Sawa, and there is a question within there, so I wanted to get to it. He said, super excited about today's show. Thank you very much, Devin. Loved you and Casper.
Yeah,
lots of stuff to talk about. Can't wait. And here's the sort of question. Love to hear your reactions to the Andre the Giant documentary that aired Tuesday on HBO. Now, unfortunately, Jeff is very cheap. He won't pay for cable, so he doesn't have HBO.
Yeah, I still got the rabbit ears.
Yes, you only get 4 channels,
black
right?
and white TV.
But Chuck has seen it.
Yeah, I did.
I saw it. What'd you think?
I loved it. I mean, just there's a lot of aspects about it that I really loved, but the bottom line is that you felt like they really dug into who he was, you know, covering life that I didn't even know about, like him having a place outside of Charlotte and this kind of being like France, finding his brother.
Daughter.
Yeah, all of this stuff like his daughter. And
still worth watching.
But man, and just, you know, the tragic kind of feel to the people around him who knew what was going on with him and all that stuff. Just a phenomenal job. I mean, it was very emotional too, especially who's the guy who worked with him the most at the end who gets
Tim
choked?
White.
Yeah, Tim White,
the referee.
And, yeah, and it's like you get to that stuff, and it's very poignant, you know, and.
Very nostalgic.
Yeah, very
It was
nostalgic.
fun to, you know, that's the era that I think we kind of grew up watching.
Big John Studd.
Oh, it was great. And also, to your point, there was legit journalism being done there, right? Like, it wasn't just on the surface, let's celebrate his life. Like, they were really trying to find out about what was true and what wasn't.
I know that they were trying to get beneath all the myths. The myths that the WWF back then was you know, that he was from Grenoble, France, and all that kind of stuff.
I believe off the top of my head, 937,000 viewers for the first run, and that is the highest, the most watched documentary for HBO in 15 years. So the promotion was phenomenal. I mean, I saw billboards everywhere. Every outlet under the sun, New York Times, etc., wrote about it. They did a great job of promoting it, but it delivered, in my opinion.
Yeah. Fascinating too, like just the Hulk Hogan stuff where he's talking about WrestleMania 3.
Oh, that was great.
That stuff was all.
That was great. That was great. So if you have not seen it,
I'm gonna watch it. I'm gonna find a way. I've been on YouTube watching all the old Andre fights.
Oh, it's great.
Just to get myself ready for it, and I'm gonna show the kids The Princess Bride.
Because that's discussed as well. Yeah. That is discussed as well. Yeah, I highly recommend it. Okay, what else do we got? Here we go. Do you think, the word think is missing, do you think Joe Rogan has checked out? It seems like he cares more about who he's doing commentary with rather than the fights. Plus, they got a stable of replacements ready to do the job. Do you guys feel like Joe has been slipping as of late?
I wouldn't say so. I mean, I think Joe is having to adjust because he's used to, look, for how many years was he sitting next to Mike Goldberg doing the same thing, always, you know, say what you want about Goldberg, but he was a consistent guy that Rogan always knew that he was sitting next to and always knew exactly how to react. Now he's worked with different people, he's working in 3-man booths, so he's had to adjust his game a little bit, and he's always been a guy who creates a narrative early on in a fight and then just carries that forward. I mean, if you can call that a flaw in his game. I guess I would say that's maybe the one flaw is that sometimes he doesn't seem to react when a fight turns. He kind of gets a narrative in his head, and that's the narrative he's going to carry through. But largely, I mean, I think he's still good at what he does.
He does tend to fixate a little bit, you know. And I think after so many years, man, you're going to have some autopilot. When I hear him, this is the best, when he does those promos where he's talking about them being the best fight, and I'm thinking, this is a guy who is a very free-thinking guy. He has his own podcast, and yet he shills out on the UFC for these fights and stuff, and it always is funny to me to contemplate that, you know, that split.
He's just as much of a promoter as he is an analyst.
He is, 100%. Right? He carries a lot of value in that, though, because I think people know
100%.
that he's a legit guy. Like, he gives the truth a lot. So when he's selling a fight, you believe him more than you would Dana White. So it's an interesting dynamic there. But he does tend to fixate a little bit. I would say that, like, you know, we were just talking about the Nurmagomedov one earlier on the show, and he does that type of thing a little bit. We used to always joke when he goes, he's in trouble here, that the guy would inevitably get out. It's almost like it's like almost the sign like he's getting out of it, like whatever chokehold it is.
Sure.
But those are just funny things. I honestly don't know what it would be like without Joe Rogan, because since I've followed the sport, I mean, and watched it, he's been right there. Goldberg, same thing. But like Joe Rogan though is just that guy. You're just so used to his voice and how he thinks of the sport.
He's a fixture, and I think he's very important to the UFC product. Or maybe I should say has been very important. I think the era in which they have introduced the third man, you know, the Brian Stan, the Dominic Cruz, the Daniel Cormier, Jimmy Smith now, I think has highlighted one thing for me, and that's that Joe Rogan is very good and maybe better than anyone at calling the action and breaking it down for the layman. But in terms of telling the story, in terms of painting the picture on the way to the cage, doing research, you know, it is standard when, you know, if you or I are calling a boxing match or a football game or a basketball game, that you sit down with the coaches before, that you sit down with the star players, do that. That doesn't happen here, and I think you miss. But then when you see a Brian Stan, who's no longer calling the fights, of course, you see that there is research being done beforehand, and I think it adds a lot to the broadcast. So that to me is missing in this sort of evolution of the MMA analyst, the UFC analyst. And I think that it's, you know, it's important to have him with a third man so that you can get that kind of stuff. Like, it's one thing to call the action, but I think it's important for fans to get that other stuff.
I remember,
as well.
and you've worked in this type of thing before. I remember I was shadowing Gegard Mousasi. I can't remember which fight it was, but it was in like Hoffman Estates.
Okay. Strike Force?
Yeah, in the Strike Force fight. I was shadowing for a piece for Fight Magazine the other day. And one of his things was he had to go sit down with the commentators.
Yeah, for Showtime.
And they did this whole, for Showtime, and they did this whole Q&A with him, got very familiar with him. It was kind of fascinating to watch, because I didn't know, I didn't know to what extent they did that sort of thing. You know what I mean?
Sometimes you'll see Dominic Cruz at Media Day.
Yeah.
And we're there for an hour talking to these guys. Like, Dominic Cruz shouldn't be going around talking to these guys at Media Day. They should be coming to him. It should be a part of the Fight Week schedule where you go and sit to the broadcast team. I will say this, I was disappointed in the weigh-ins, made several mistakes, and this has become somewhat common. You know, like to call Kyle Bochniak Zabit Magomedsharipov as he's standing on the scale, to me, is an egregious mistake, because Zabit is not just some random Russian guy on the roster. He's one of the brightest young prospects. There was a mix-up with the Felice Herrig fight and where that was placed on the card. And little things, like, to me, John Anik is the very best MMA play-by-play guy in the sport right now. I mean, he is the gold standard right now. There are some great ones, but to me, John Anik is
feverishly. You see, he posts his notes all the time, like he's ridiculous.
And little things like pronunciation, he is flawless. And John Anik is. This is just one thing that kind of gets to me. Like, he is pronouncing Karolina Kovačević's name perfectly.
Yeah.
Joe Rogan is sitting right next to him, listening to him, and is mispronouncing her name every single time. And now you have called multiple fights of hers. And I know they get the audio files. This woman deserves to have her name pronounced correctly on the broadcast. So it's little things like that. And I know the producers are telling them, you know, because I know that's what they do. That's their job. You gotta. So basically, the reason I asked this question is, do I think he's slipping? No, I think that's actually been a staple of his broadcast for years.
Yes.
But I do think the fact that people are starting to notice, because of how well researched the other broadcasts have become and how good John Anik is at his job, that it's becoming a lot more glaring over the years.
It's funny because I think the things you're mentioning, the little mistakes or the little, like, that's just so Joe Rogan. And everybody's so used to who he is that you don't think about it. But ultimately, like you just mentioned, some of the pronunciations, I agree. I'm like, come on, man. Like, there's weird stuff like that, but it is funny because I feel like he's like if you look at it as a family, you know, he's just that guy. Well, you accept him on his terms.
Right. All right, let's move along. What else do we have? We actually have a bunch, so we gotta move through these. Okay, why have interim titles become so frequently used in 2018 as opposed to the 2000s? Now, we have talked about this ad nauseum, but I do think it was important, and it's maybe not something we have to necessarily debate, but fans need to realize that the UFC believes that if titles are on the line, then it's okay to sell a pay-per-view, like, even if it's interim or not, but we need a title on the line, and that's really what it comes down to. Right. More shows, you need more titles, you need more title fights, there are injuries, and back in the day, there were 6 pay-per-views a year.
They need to understand a big fight is a big fight, because at some point this is just an archaic way of dealing with the situation. Introducing, well, we need to plug up these holes, and there's other holes sprouting up. You know, it's like it makes it. I've talked about this last week. You want the sport to be accessible, and the more that you clouded up with these like interim fights, and then there's this is going on because this is not happening, and you know what I mean. You keep these scenarios.
McGregor proved that you don't need a title fight to be a big fight, right?
Yes.
Even McGregor Khabib, if there's no title on the line, is still a mammoth fight.
Huge.
You don't need that, and yet they feel the need to do it. So that's really what it comes down to. There's more shows, and they feel like they need more title fights.
More belts.
There's
a lot more belts now.
More divisions. Okay, let's move along now. What else do we have? What's the best martial art to start with, to build upon, before stepping into the octagon?
We go back. This is one of those internal questions, right? Because it's like an Ouroboros, it just goes around. But I think that I still believe wrestling.
I agree.
Yeah.
I wanted to know if you guys disagree, but I think it's been.
I feel like wrestling is it may not be the one that's going to finish the fights, but it's going to be the one that's going to determine where the fight is contested. So if you want to be standing with someone who's like a great jiu-jitsu guy, well, your defensive wrestling is going to keep the fight standing. If you don't want to be contending with that guy who's got great kicks or punches, you take him down. So I think wrestling is the great. It's kind of like the balancing.
Yeah.
Balancing art.
It's funny too. There's just a lot of extra sides to go into wrestling. If you compete in wrestling growing up, obviously you're used to weight cutting. You're used to doing things properly that end up being a big thing that you do in MMA. So as far as a base, and if you're competing growing up, I would think that wrestling would be the base you'd want.
Yeah, another name to remember: Arjun Buller, who's returning to action on Saturday, an Olympic wrestler who, to me, reminds me of a young Daniel Cormier. And so this is a guy who I think the UFC has high hopes for, especially given the Indian background.
Yeah.
But that's a guy who, you put him in there against an elite striker, I'm probably siding with him just given the base that he has, even though he's not an elite striker himself, or even close to an elite striker at this juncture.
Yeah.
It still feels like wrestling
just like
is
with
the foundation.
Cormier, right? Because with Cormier, it's like no matter who he's fighting,
yeah.
you're always like, yeah, but he could wrestle him. He could wrestle him.
Look at the
think
Volkan fight.
Yeah.
At the end of the day, he could go to that. All right, next up. How scary is being a journalism student or journalist on the come up in terms of the job market these days? What do you guys think?
Jeez.
Is it a scary time?
Well, I can't help. I mean, it's going to be for sure, because how many jobs are there? I mean, there's just not that many jobs in the MMA sphere. So there's dedicated sites. We work at MMA Fighting, and there's MMA Junkie. There's a couple of sites, but then you have like ESPN. You have some of the ones that just have an MMA faction, and there just aren't that many. I would think it would be scary, and it's also not just that. It's just the changing of the times. From print. Obviously that's become like a bygone day. It's also like what kind of material do people want. I love to write features and columns. That's not necessarily what is the most important thing these days that people want to click on. People like different material. They like easy, digestible material, which is disheartening for guys like me. You know what I mean? But at the same time, that's the way it is. It's not like you can fight the time. So it depends on what you want to be doing. But I would think unless you have an inroad somehow, or you just have something that you really believe you can contribute, I'd be a little nervous getting into the.
Can I ask you guys about this trend? The athletic is a hot topic, and we could talk. I love this type of discussion, but it feels like finally, 20 years after the internet exploded, right? Like I remember getting internet in our home around 1997, and it was of course a much different internet, but going to NBA.com and so here we are like 20 plus years later, right? Now it seems like people are starting to figure out, like, we need to start charging for this. And so, you see something like The Athletic, which is charging, I think, $5.99 or $6.99. ESPN just came out with an app today that they're charging $4.99. And it feels like finally people are starting to recognize, like, we can't keep giving away this stuff for free. Do you feel like, so for a young journalist like this, is this actually promising that outlets are starting to figure out that, is this the savior, or is this a sign that,
Well, I think it's
the industry is
I think it's a sign that things evolve. I mean, how often I can't even think about how often this happens, where I get an email or a phone call from some friend of mine or somebody in the family who says, I've got a niece or I've got a nephew who wants to go into journalism. Do you have any advice? And I always say, well, when I went to college a long time ago, I got into this business a long time ago. The things that got me into this business don't apply anymore. None of that stuff is real. And if you're going to be trying to enter this field now, you need to be looking at the way things are now. And I think the thing you just talked about is certainly a good example. The old journalism. I mean, I left the Boston Globe in 2005, and within 5 years, the sports department staff, actually the entire editorial staff, was half of what it was when I left. And now it's even smaller. So that thing of like newspapers and magazines, that's all shrinking. That's the journalism that I came up in. Now it's websites, and it's particularly, you know, innovative things like websites where you have to pay a subscription ahead of time. These are the things that, so if you're getting into journalism now, you really need to be looking at what does the landscape look like right today?
Well, at first, it was all about how can these existing entities switch to the internet. So like I used to work at Alternative News Weekly, the LA Weekly, back in the day. They had to figure out how to change and become an online entity. This was everybody's task, right? So this went on, and everybody learned how to do it, and it was all ad-driven, and pop-ups and all this stuff. So now these things come up, and the big thing is like, do you want to pay it and not see pop-ups anymore? Because I hate going on the Denver Post, to be honest. Like, Denver Post is where I go. I love the Denver sports teams, and it's always just clicking out of these things, the things coming up. Like all of a sudden you're hearing audio, you're like, what is that coming from? You're trying to figure it out. Well, The Athletic is obviously, they're like, well, we're going to present this very clean aesthetic that's not going to be interfered, and you're just going to see the writing and the pictures. And I'm like, yeah, that's appealing. You know what I mean? It's kind of, and not to mention they're gutting all of the, the sports pages. Like they just took all the Denver Post 3 beat writers from 3 different sports.
It's kind of scary because
if
that entity somehow, just drowns. Like they've gutted a lot of people. What kind of worries me is that I feel like the audience has been programmed to get everything for free to a degree. Like I feel this way as well as a consumer of sports media. Like I've been spoiled, right? Everything is just a click away, and it's all for the most part free. And now you have to reprogram people. You know, I did that interview with Connor, and they charged $4.99 for it. That's cheaper than the coffee that I got on my way here. And yet I was bombarded with hatred, because how dare you? Yet in your era, like when you're coming up, I subscribed to Sports Illustrated. You have to buy. I was subscribed to the Montreal Gazette. Like everything I wanted media-wise, I had to pay for. But now, for the past 20 years, and especially, our friend Jeremy Botter put out a poll yesterday. Like, would you pay for an MMA version of The Athletic? And I saw that 72% of the people, out of like maybe 1,000 or so, said hell no, because I feel like the MMA audience in particular has been programmed because they've been born online to just get everything for free. On top of the fact that they have to pay for pay-per-views, so to get the big fights, you have to pay for pay-per-view as opposed to watching on NBC or ABC an NBA game, and you have to pay for Fight Pass. So you're already being forced to pay for a lot of things. But I don't know if the MMA fan is willing, because they've sort of been programmed to not pay for things, and now you have to sort of change those habits. The one advice that I always give to people right off the bat is be different. You have to look at the landscape and just be different. And if you're different, look, there's more avenues now than ever, right? There's Twitter, there's Facebook, there's YouTube, there's podcasts, there's definitely more outlets than when you were coming up, right?
Absolutely. Well,
but you got to be different because now there's more competition, right?
Yeah.
So that's the thing.
Yeah, totally. Yeah. No.
Fascinating topic. I love that question. Okay, let's move along now. Where does Chad Mendes fit in the featherweight division upon his return? So Chad is back in the summertime. His suspension is finally up. Do you feel like he is a player right away, or do you think they have to bring him up slowly? Because he is a fresh face for Max Holloway, right? If he gets by Brian Ortega, Holloway has pretty much gone through that division. We'll see what happens with Frankie Edgar next weekend in Atlantic City, but I feel like Mendes kind of slides in there rather quickly.
It's funny how much we've forgotten about Chad Mendes,
right?
How dominant he's been. Where was his record when we last left out? Did he win or lose? Because that was
he had just been knocked out by Frankie.
Right.
Remember the night before 194. And
so I think that you still have to go back and look at that. I mean, you try to like. So who do you give him? I would bring him back for some. I would not give him like a no name, but I'd give him a middle ground fight and then see where he's at, because that's a long time away and.
Maybe like a Ricardo Lamas type.
That would be
Lamas's book.
Honestly, yes. Somebody like that would be perfect.
Yeah, give him a top 10, but sort of probably middle to lower end of the top 10. See if he looks great, and then zip him up there.
But definitely, I mean, that's a shot in the arm for that division, I would think, because him versus Max, if he gets a couple of wins, I feel like is a pretty intriguing fight. Okay, moving along. What else do we have? As a silly non-MMA question, which member of the Beatles would each of you be, and what are your favorite Beatles songs?
Well, that's not for us to determine. This was who was the guy? Orange.
Oh yes. Orange Ape.
He already established.
Yeah, he did
a Beatles one. He had you as.
He screwed that up.
He had you. Ringo. He had you as Ringo.
Ringo's the man.
He had him as Ringo. Yes. He had me as Paul, which is I'm not a Paul.
You're not?
No,
so you don't like.
I would be. I feel like I would, if I was going to be a Beatle, it would be John or George would be the ones that I would probably I think George would be probably the one.
Okay. And what do you have? Me and Luke
We
as?
had you as George and Luke as John. I think that's how we had it. And so I think it was all off.
Yeah, it was off.
I think
I am not George.
I think you're a Paul.
Yeah.
See, I should have been George. You should have been Ringo.
I feel like you're perfect for Ringo. Peace and love, peace and love. No? No? Not a fan?
You didn't seem offended, but your wife was very offended.
Was she? Really?
Oh, yeah.
What did she think?
I haven't talked to her since. I don't know.
She posted something, and then I said something.
Where did she post
and
this?
Without,
Is she on Twitter, your wife?
She is.
and without even.
How do I not know this?
Without even acknowledging, and I showed the picture to my wife, and she said, "Well, at least you weren't Ringo."
Wow. Ringo's the worst?
Ringo, no. Well,
Ringo's great, but it's
Wait,
just
is your wife, does she have the same Twitter tone as you? Is she as sarcastic as you are?
funnier than he is.
Really?
Way better.
Wow. I need to find her.
You'll never find her.
Can you give her name a shout out or you don't want to?
I'm not gonna because
I don't know.
You don't want people going. Best Beatles song, favorite Beatles song?
Oh man, there's so many.
I mean, there's everyone. I mean, there's hardly.
Not one that.
Across the Universe is good.
I saw her standing there. It's probably my favorite if I had to pick one.
I
Love Your
listening-
Hideaway.
I don't know if I know that one.
Hide Your Love Away.
Which one?
Whatever it's
The one that he just said.
No, Hide Your Love Away.
Oh, okay. I don't know. I feel like I know a lot of the Beatles
always
songs,
used
but
to
I
do
don't
it.
know their names. But I know Here Comes the Sun. I like Here Comes
Yeah,
the
that's
Sun.
a good one.
That's a good one.
Three Little Birds.
All right, let's move along. A few more left. We'll go rapid fire here. What did you guys think of the MMA fights on the baseball field yesterday?
Yeah.
Yankees, Sox, Padres, Rockies.
It's all about the Rockies one.
Yeah, what do you
Because
think?
it was Arenado. I mean, you don't toss the ball at Arenado.
Who got the better of who in that one? Padres, Rockies.
I mean, Arenado went out. He charged the mound. The pitcher threw his glove at him. You know how they do that? Like he tries to chuck
that's
the
the
glove
best.
at him. He dodged that, and then they kind of went off the mound. And Arenado threw a pretty good punch. I don't think it really connected, but it was a big punch. So he meant
I
to do
love
some harm.
those brawls. Those
Me
brawls
too.
are the best.
They're
They're so sloppy.
I find them so comical. Last night I was getting
You see all
a
the-
text from
Yeah.
my buddy who's a editor on ESPN's MLB desk. He said, "Oh, you got to see this," and my text back to him was, UFC fighters are better at hitting baseballs than baseball players are at fighting. And he's like, I can't disagree with that.
That pretty much sums it up. That
I thought it was
sums
cool
up.
that we had 2 brawls on a given day, though.
Yeah. What does it say about the players? They seem to be very
on edge.
riled up
Feisty,
these
yeah.
days. Beginning of the season.
all that athletic
Okay,
stuff.
moving along. Given the crowd reaction to Roman Reigns at WrestleMania, who would the panel consider to be the biggest failed pushes in MMA history, i.e. fighters that promoters have really gotten behind but flopped in some
good
way?
question.
Yeah, I thought it was a great question. Let me tell you something. The questions this week were phenomenal.
Yeah.
They really were. Anyone come to mind?
There's been, I mean, Sage Northcutt it's not like they're bad that the fans didn't get behind them, but they just haven't.
What about Paige?
I was going to say Paige Van Zant is probably the one that stands out the most right this second. I still feel like this is so weird, like this push of Paige Van Zant, who I don't know. That's all I'll say. But maybe her.
Yeah, I don't even know about that. I mean, I'm not. First, I don't know too much about Roman Reigns, and
Yeah, but you get the question.
I don't really know what is the.
It's just people crap all over it. Like they're not accepting
he's not
him
a
as
guy
the
who-
savior,
They're
the
trying to
babyface.
push him, and he's not
Yes.
making the.
We're on there's no big scale person like that. Is
Yeah.
there? Like because you have to earn it.
You have
get
to
there.
kind of come up the
But
ranks.
what about guys like Artem Lobov? I mean, the bottom line is he gets pushed on because of Conor. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Right.
It's a fun question to ponder, but there's no perfect answer.
Yeah, because you did have to earn it to some
You have
extent.
to
I mean, like McGregor would have been the one if he had come into the UFC and flopped, because he came with a lot of publicity before he ever fought in this company. And I'm not sure that who else is like
You
that.
don't see
Hector Lombard,
maybe.
came in the big.
I mean, you
signing.
don't see big people like up at the top who are pushed by the UFC. It doesn't match what the acceptance is.
Right,
If they're pushed by the UFC, there's a reason for it.
Yeah.
It's just a different dynamic.
Sure.
You know?
All right. Fair enough. A circle and a square. I think that's what you call it. Okay. 2 left here. What do we got? Was last week the most or least fun of your MMA journalism careers?
Yes.
Which one?
Yep.
Both? Okay.
Yeah,
so both.
I agree. Yeah, definitely.
It was both, kind of, wasn't
Yeah,
it?
it was-
It was so bizarre.
Surreal is the word I keep
I would
saying.
never say worst.
Yeah.
Because it's still from a journalist covering the sport, when there's chaos like that, it can be fun in another way because you have to dissect it in so many different ways. And you were ended up on like Jim Rome and all these like you're doing all this type of things. I was on these weird stations I'd never been on either, and it's fun because everybody's sort of lost in the hysteria, and that's always a fun sort of aspect to it. But there's a part of me that's like, because you're answering questions about Conor's behavior and and things like that. That's
and
very
almost having to
unfun.
defend the sport, right?
Yeah,
like,
and then you get into that. Like you said, the misperception of like, is this what the sport? Like people.
Is it wrong that I felt a little sad? Like when I saw that shot of him walking out of the station in handcuffs, like that kind of bummed me out, right? Like this is the LeBron James of our sport. This is the biggest star in the history of the sport. No one wants to see him in that light. Whether or not you're a fan of his fighting style or not, it kind of bummed me out.
Isn't it? Yes,
right?
It bummed me out. But isn't it strange? Exactly, with two transcendent stars in the sport and back-to-back days, right? Or in the same weekend. One of them's on a WrestleMania stage, like doing this crazy thing. Right. One of them's coming out of a jail cell. It's just like.
I mean, I guess that was the thing. Everything seemed to get mixed into this weird gumbo. Even things that were not related to each other. You mentioned, well, you didn't mention her name, but there's Rousey, there's Brock Lesnar. These are MMA names, and they're sort of on a different stage. Then you had all the nonsense that went on with McGregor, but then separate from that, you have this, the main event falling apart, coming back together again, and it all, like at some point I was like sort of relating all this stuff, then I'm realizing, wait a minute, McGregor had nothing to do with the main event falling apart, and nothing, all that stuff didn't really relate to each other, but it did. So it was kind of like,
well, the card crumbling in front of our eyes, right? Losing these matchups by the hour. I mean, the whole thing was unlike anything I've ever seen. And so I guess if you ask me, like, is it fun to do your job and report? Yeah, of course, it's fun to be busy, right? It's fun to go after stories, but it was, for the most part, it was all kind of depressing stuff. It was fights falling through. It wasn't exciting news to celebrate, right? It wasn't like, oh, big matchups.
I mean, you're involved in it, like you're one of the key pieces, but it's like, I was a little bit more of an outsider. I wasn't here the whole time, but it's like the way the MMA media adjusted to the events was pretty admirable, I thought.
I thought it was a good week for us.
Everybody jumped right in, it doesn't matter how aggressive it was, everybody jumped where they needed to be and covered it, which was really cool.
MMA media gets painted with this brush, and I feel, perhaps it's the advent of the MMAJA, which, by the way, the elections are going on as we speak. Very exciting.
Let's check the polls.
It was also a weird thing. I mean, personally for me, it was weird because amidst all the chaos of what was going on in the sport, I was also in the midst of transitioning from being like an editor in the blogs desk to working with the combat sports team and learning a whole new, even though it's the same company, I was with a whole different like system of how you put stories up online, and I was kind of, it was a lot of that was a blur to me. And then meanwhile, the material that I was having to deal with was just bizarre. So it was kind of like on 5 different levels. It was a very twisted thing.
I talked to you a little bit. It was so weird to be like, I'm a columnist mostly. You're writing columns, and how difficult it is to contextualize everything.
I was thinking of that. Yeah,
you have to then. There's so much you have to peel back if you're trying to make a point. Well, you have to peel this back. If you're somebody who doesn't really know the full story, you have to keep peeling it back, and it went on and on and on. It was almost impossible to do in a very clean.
Oh man,
piece,
give me a documentary starting at Tony Ferguson on the Fox lot, injuring his knee, all the way up until Saturday night in Khabib. Give me a documentary, like a day-by-day breakdown of that.
That would be insane.
Right? Yeah. It would be amazing. Okay, let's go to the last one. Can we get the last one here? And then we'll wrap things up. What do we have?
This is a good one. Oh.
Where do you keep your ketchup? The fridge or the cupboard? Let's end on a very, very high and important note.
Do you not have to put ketchup in the fridge? Once you open the package, once you open the thing, you don't have to put it in the fridge? I thought you had to put it in the fridge.
That was a good question.
Well, if it's unopened, if I buy it from the store and you haven't opened it, I always keep it in my cupboard.
Then it's in the cupboard.
But then you refrigerate it.
Doesn't it have like, refrigerate after opening? I mean, maybe I'm mistaken.
Yeah, I feel like, maybe. I feel like the ones in the bottle, I've seen people put them in cupboards, but maybe I'm wrong. Maybe once opening, you have to.
Working in the restaurant industry back in the day, they didn't I don't recall them refrigerating.
Yeah, because it's never cold when they give it to you. It's like sitting on the table the whole day.
Tray under
Wow, this is mind blowing. Yeah. Now I will have a new relationship to ketchup.
So to answer this question, both of you refrigerated upon.
Only after I've opened it.
Okay.
After I've opened it.
Are you big ketchup guys? I'm a huge ketchup guy.
I like ketchup.
Not on meat.
Not on meat. Not on hot dogs though.
Why? I love ketchup on hot dogs.
Not on hot dogs. Mustard is a hot dog.
Mustard is hot dog.
Really?
Yeah.
hummus for wraps.
Stop it with that.
And
Stop it. To me, I never put mustard on a hot dog. Always ketchup.
What?
Just ketchup and relish. And maybe pineapple.
pineapple.
No.
Oh, God.
This show is over now.
Thank God Luke isn't here because we'd get a 10-minute diatribe on.
10 minutes. You kidding me? Was it going to be
dump
brief
you
this
up.
time?
Right. Okay, that does it. Thank you once again for all the great questions. Really, phenomenal stuff. And we could have done 4 hours on the questions. I can't even imagine how many we missed. So thank you very much for that. Great stuff. We appreciate you watching our coverage. Not just today, of course, but over the past 7 weeks as we now kind of transition back into a normal life. UFC on Fox this weekend, Bellator is in Missouri with a fine card as well. The train moves along, but really want to thank you for checking out our coverage all week long. And of course, we'll be back next week to recap what will probably be another newsworthy week in the sport of mixed martial arts. For the entire crew, for Jeff, for Chuck, I am Ariel. Again, thanks so much for watching. Enjoy your weekend and enjoy the fights.